Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Intersection, a series of the IQT Podcast where we discuss topics relating to the intersection of technology and national security. I'm very excited about today's guest and topic. Today's guest is Steve LeVine, editor of The Electric, a publication on batteries and electric vehicles, of which I'm a subscriber to, and also a former foreign correspondent with the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Newsweek. He's also an author, and his latest book is The Powerhouse, which discusses the race to invent the advanced lithium ion battery, a.k.a. the super battery. And today's conversation is going to be around the strategic importance of batteries and their supply chain and how it's affecting the nation-state competition between China and the United States. So, Steve, welcome to The Intersection. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Great. So, I always like to start with a little bit of background on our guest here, in particular, because I think we have a lot of young listeners or subscribers here, to talk a little bit about how you ended up where you are today. So, in particular, you were a journalist, a foreign correspondent, it sounds like, with some, just absolutely premier brand media companies. How did you end up moving from that world to the world of batteries and electric vehicles?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a possibly surprising answer to it. It's a linear progression, and that's that. I was 18 years abroad, moving from one venue to another, the Philippines, then to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and finally the former Soviet Union. And at one point in time, each one of those places were geopolitics ground zero, and so that's what I was covering the whole time, and so my autopilot takes me to, okay, what are the geopolitics of what I'm looking at? And when my last posting was on the Caspian Sea, I was in the stands, and this was the struggle between Russia and the United States. Who's going to control that oil there? And all kinds of ramifications sprung and continue to spring from that. When I got back, that was the subject of my first book. When I got back to the States, I was here a few years, and I was ready to do my next book, and was hearing about batteries, a lot about batteries. This is during the Obama presidency, right after the financial crash, 2009, 2010. And what I kept hearing is that big countries were gravitating toward batteries and electric vehicles as an initial new industry of the future, something to center at least part of their struggling economies on. And what I saw was the initial throes of competition between China and the United States. If these couple of industries were going to happen, if they were going to be as big as people thought they could become, that would be a geopolitical race. What I was doing was replacing oil and geopolitics with batteries and geopolitics, and that turned into my first book, my third book. You already mentioned it, and I dropped that after the book came out, but as you know, a mania has erupted over the last couple of years around batteries again, and I've been pulled back in.
Well, yeah, I think that's a great story, and it brings up the analogy I want to open our conversation with, which is, I think a lot of our listeners will understand the importance of oil in the geopolitical race or conflict or competition that exists around the world. Obviously, numerous wars and conflicts have been fought over oil for years. People more recently have paid a lot of attention to the microelectronics supply chain and how strategically important that is. It's not clear to me that everyone quite understands the strategic importance of batteries, but I would argue that the battery supply chain is the next microelectronic supply chain when it comes to a focus of government competition, innovation, funding, and protectionism. At some level, it sounds like you agree with that thesis. And tell me a little bit about what you discovered in writing the Powerhouse, and in sort of pivoting your area of focus, if you will, to batteries, about what is the current state of affairs, if you will, when it comes to the battery landscape.
Yeah, I should say I totally agree totally with you. Batteries are a flashpoint, and we can get to that, just as a point of opinion. The interesting thing when I wrote the book, so that again, that's 2015. It came out. The paperback came out the next year. This book was about the invention of NMC. NMC is the leading cathode. That's the most popular battery in electric vehicles today. And when I say the most popular, I mean almost every EV on the planet contains NMC, and basically all the batteries in the West, all the EV batteries in Europe, the United States have that battery in it. And I was embedded with a team that invented NMC for 2 years to write that book.
And that team was where?
Argonne.
Yep.
Argonne National Lab in
right.
Chicago. Yeah. And they were about the book is about the attempt to invent NMC 2.0. And that's the narrative you're following all the way through. But when that book came out, batteries and EVs were still an aspiration. The cost of making batteries was about 5 times, was still 5 times what they are today. And Elon Musk had the Model S. He hadn't yet come out with the Model 3 or the Model Y. So it was, and the S cost $100,000 or more, depending what you got in it. So the electric car for the every person was a dream, and people, there were a lot of doubts around it. Remember, it's only a couple years ago Musk and Tesla were still widely regarded as a fraud. And it was 2020 when he kind of came out of his out of the bad years and started amassing quarter by quarter profit. And so that's one thing. So what I'm leading to there is that we had an inflection point. We went from in the last 2 years. It's since around the fall of 2020 when it finally dawned on big auto around the world, right? The legacy automobile companies here in the United States and in Japan and South Korea. Hey, Tesla is for real. China is for real. We've got to get our act together. And so that's only 2 years old. What we're looking at is only 2 years old. That's a transition moment. That's an inflection point. And we've had another, we've had a couple of other inflection points since then. And we have a third coming up. 2025 is a big year when everyone plans to have dozens of electric cars on the road. What are we looking at? Your question is what are we looking at today? We have gone from aspiration to it's the real thing to the United States, and this inflection point is just last month, Joe Biden signs the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, is really a climate bill with a big component of electric car and battery funding in it. That is the U.S. saying we're in the race. We're going to compete with China, and so that's a big inflection point. And so it's we're in big geopolitics. It's the equivalent, when I was on the Caspian Sea, when I was in the stands, the big thing was pipeline politics, right? You could have oil in the ground, but that's worth nothing unless you can get it to the market. So the strategic center was a pipeline. Could the United States affect the construction of an independent oil pipeline, independent of Russia? And if it could, then these states would have effective economic and by extension political sovereignty from Russia. The equivalent today of a pipeline is metals processing. It's so you can own lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese. They're dispersed around the world, but can you do anything with them? And China has cornered over the last decade the capacity to process these metals. Almost all batteries and almost all metals that make those batteries do something are made or processed in China. That's why China has the commanding heights in batteries, in EVs, and now the U.S. has said we're getting into that race. And incidentally, Europe as well. Europe, as it stands, is ahead of the United States in this race.
Okay, a lot of great points there. I want to follow up, but let me just set the stage a little bit for some of the listeners who aren't as deep in this area as you and I are. So one might ask the question, well, batteries been around forever. What's new? And I think what you communicated just now that is new is that the battery, the rechargeable battery for electronic vehicles is becoming the energy source for mobility around the world, replacing oil and gas as such. And so an EV, electric vehicles battery, has certain requirements that are new to the battery world in terms of ability to be rechargeable, the ability to have enough energy density to power a vehicle for 300 or 400 miles, and the cost demand of it being cost affordable enough to fit into the vehicle. And those requirements, correct me if I'm wrong, have led us towards the lithium ion battery, which is what you focus a lot of your attention on as sort of the solution there. And so the key thing to understand is what's the future with lithium ion batteries. Would you agree with that summary?
Yes, that was so well done. Thank you.
Okay. Great. All right. So to your point, then, there's the lithium ion battery supply chain. It composes of the sourcing of a couple of different materials: lithium, copper, nickel, magnesium, are sort of the four off the top of my head. I may be missing one. And those are found in various places around the world. But then it's not just about sourcing them; it's about the processing of them. And the processing of that is a very dirty business, right? And so a lot of the Western countries, U.S., Europe, didn't like to see the processing done in those countries because of the environmental concerns. So the natural place the processing ended up happening was China. And so while a lot of those materials are sourced in China, an even higher percentage of those materials are processed in China. Is that also a fair summary of where we are?
Except for one part, China buys most of its imports most of its metals.
Right. Yeah. Right. So they're not so much. Yeah, there are some metals out there or some materials out there that China is very good at sourcing. This is not that. It's not about the sourcing. It's about the processing. That is where China's chokehold in the supply chain is. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about why that's important. And I think why that is important is because the demand curve, and people listening just on the podcast aren't going to see me draw my graph lines with my hands here, but the demand curve is growing exponentially to some of the things you talked to, which is some of the mandates for a number of electronic vehicles, sold in the United States, sold in California. California has their own set of mandates. Europe and the general market trend is driving towards an exponential increase in demand. And this is not a supply chain that you can very quickly expand the supply of, right? The best expression I've heard of this so far is that it only takes a couple of years to build a battery factory, but it takes 6 or 7 years to build a new lithium mine or a new cobalt mine or a new nickel mine. So all of a sudden, you're going to have worldwide demand increasing significantly for a lot of these materials, and you just can't increase the spigot of supply very quickly. So what are the consequences of that sort of phenomenon, if you will?
Yeah, yeah. Just to broaden that out a bit, the transistor, transistor is invented in 1948, and the reverberations of that hit us in the 1990s, basically starting in the 1990s, and the whole, our whole lives revolve around portable devices, right? The laptop, the smartphone, our earbuds, you know, all kinds of all kinds of things, and growing. So there's there are those, and there's the increasing electrification of power around the world. All of that and vehicles are enabled by batteries, right? None of that, like what I just described, your life, right? Everything that you know from the time you wake up, you rub your eyes, and you pick up your phone. Everyone does that, right? And that wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for the lithium ion battery. So what I'm trying to say is that like a big part of the engine of the global economy and what makes things go centers on the capacity to have those batteries, to make those batteries, and to make them better. And what we're talking about today, the subject we're talking about today, is, well, who controls that? Who, and it's not dispersed power; it is concentrated power. So this matters, and it matters this way. We've learned since the 1970s what it means when power over the commodity that animates the global economy is concentrated in few hands. That's OPEC. And do we want, as it stands, and this is the way it is going to be because of the calculus that you just laid out, which is how long it takes to build a battery supply chain if you start today. This supply chain, controlled by China, is going to be monopolized by China through the 2020s. When the U.S. is saying we're getting into the game, Europe is saying it's getting into the game. We're talking about the 2030s. So we've got a decade of trying to make this work. It's going to be a very chaotic and tense decade. How are we going to make these years work when we are explicitly and visibly, making trying to extract ourselves, to divide the world into new spheres, to reshore, and all. Who are we reshoring from? Who are we extracting ourselves from? It's China. Who do we need to make our electronics and mobile future work this decade? China. So how do those coexist? That's the question. That's a security question for the next decade.
That's very well said. And to one of the points you made earlier, right? It's the power that OPEC has had since the 1970s to influence world events. It's the power that Russia is trying to exert on Europe through its natural gas pipeline manipulations to mess with the European economy. It's the power that we fear China could exert on the microelectronic supply chain if they ever took control of Taiwan and TSMC in Taiwan. The good news is, to your point, is Europe and the U.S. are waking up to this concern. The bad news is it's just not a very nimble supply chain to manipulate. But we see, I think, in the legislation that just passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as you correctly point out, is really more of a climate and energy act than is an Inflation Reduction Act. It has some tax incentives out there for U.S. electronic vehicle manufacturers to source a certain percentage of their supply chain from the U.S. They have subsidies in place for people to expand in mining and development and processing of some of these chemicals here in the U.S. What are, in your mind, what are the U.S. and Europe doing to attack this problem, and what should they be doing? Maybe that they're not, or that's not being talked about very much.
Yeah. Well, so it's still early, and it's a complicated. The U.S. Act is it's it's a complicated thing. It's not easy to understand, and companies that I talk to are still trying to figure out, how does it affect me, and do I have to change my game because of this law? But it's big. Like I think the reverberation, even though it doesn't do everything, and you can quibble with it, and I quibble with it, right? There are problems with it, but I think in economics, in business, influence happens on the margins. You don't have to pay for the whole thing to get someone to do something. If you pay a little bit of it, it's kind of an incentive. Suddenly, people want to do that, and so I do think it's going to have a big impact. I do think that the U.S. is we're going to see action. What aren't we seeing that I think is necessary? A game plan. So I think it does matter what the battery chain looks like at the end of the 2020s, and we don't want to come back to a conversation. You and me, Steve. We don't want to talk again in the year 2030, and the whole thing was a cock up, or we build a bunch of anode factories and no cathode factories, or and so I do think there needs to be a brain up there that's directing the investments. We're allergic to industrial policy, and we don't want to pick winners, but we want things to go right. We want the industry. What does a battery supply chain look like? So that's what someone should do, and make sure that the investments are spread the way generally the way we want things to end up.
Right. So one of the things we're seeing, right, is some joint ventures being put in place between car manufacturers like a Tesla or a GM or a Honda or BMW with some of the battery manufacturers, whether that's a Panasonic or an LG or someone like that. We're seeing new natural mineral deposits being developed in places like Chile and Argentina and Australia and places like that. So there's a lot of activity here to try and put things in place, to your point, to start addressing the problem in the late 2020s, early 2030s. Is there anything in particular that's caught your eye? Any particular project, any particular company? Tesla's obviously, on the cutting edge of this stuff that you think listeners should be paying attention to when it comes to this area?
Well, the thing that catches my eye, well, first, all of the announcements we see so far precede the Inflation Reduction Act. These were things that the companies were already doing, and so we haven't seen a reverberation yet. But I think that's because people are kind of shell shocked. It happened as a surprise, and I like that Joe Manchin, when the auto companies in the beginning said, thanks very much, Joe, but can you slow it down a little bit? We're not going to be able to take advantage of the credits in the first few years. And he said, no, if you want the credits, then create this industry. There does need to be a hard-nosed approach. The thing that catches my eye is what we don't see, and that's LFP. So this is so we see all of the factories so far announced are NMC batteries, nickel based batteries. Nickel is among the most challenged metals on the planet. I mean, there just isn't enough nickel. It's the limiting factor, and it will remain. It and lithium, but nickel more than lithium. The limiting factor in how many batteries can be built. It does not make sense to continue to put all of your eggs into the nickel basket. And there is an alternative, LFP, which is an iron-based
Tell
battery.
people what LFP stands for. Sorry.
Lithium iron phosphate.
Yep.
So no nickel, no cobalt, no manganese. It's
Yep.
an
And cobalt has issues about where it's found and
yeah.
how it's extracted from the ground. There's a lot of child labor and other issues going on there. So people are trying to move away from cobalt as well. Is that fair?
Yes, and so iron is everywhere, and in fact, there's a lot of scrap. We're filled with scrap iron. You can start out by using, and then phosphorus also is one of the most common elements in the Earth's crust. So these batteries, it doesn't have the energy density as nickel based, but it's good enough and improving. And the Chinese are improving it. And so why are the auto companies and the battery companies that they're working with not? Oh, why aren't we hearing more about LFP? China controls virtually 100% of the global LFP capacity. This is where the U.S. should be going. I think it's a big puzzle. I think the answer is that, well, we already made that decision. We don't want to change that. It's the old problem of legacy big companies. They already made a decision. They don't want to change it. Well, they're going to have to change it.
Right. Well, that's what we're about. The intersection is the disruption that comes with new technology. So LFP is something maybe we'll start digging into here. Steve, we've hit our time here. I think did want to give you a chance to make any last points that we haven't had a chance to make yet, and then I'll follow up with one last question here. But was there anything that we haven't had a chance to talk to yet that you'd like to hit up?
No, I just just to wrap up and say that batteries and EVs, that this intersection between them and geopolitics is it's an important and totally fascinating spot to understand what's going on in the world geopolitically and economically, and they're going to continue to be through this decade and into the 2030s. I urge your listeners and viewers to peel an eye for them.
Fantastic. Well, look, this has been a terrific conversation. Very excited. As I said, I'm a subscriber to your newsletter, The Electric. But tell your listeners where we can find your work and subscribe if they're interested based on this conversation.
Yeah. Well, just if you Google Steve LeVine and The Electric, it will come up. It'll be the first thing that comes up. And subscribe for all your family members and relatives.
Sounds good. All right, Steve, thank you very much for joining us at the intersection today. This topic, I think, will be one that we'll continue to come back to over and over again, because as we've discussed, I think this is there's an article that came out here in late August about the headline was "The Decade of the Battery," but the battery is going to be the fundamental underlying technology that's going to drive a lot of our economy and innovation going forward here. And so people need to understand and learn what's going on. And they couldn't do better. There's not a better way to further their education than subscribing to your newsletter. So thanks a lot. And thank you everyone for joining us at the intersection today.
Produced by Heartcast Media.